everybody. We are going to talk today about natural selection and how it is impacted by genetics and how we see it going through evolution of time. All right, natural selection are two essential questions for this unit. How can you identify changes in genetic traits over several generations? What are the differences between natural selection and selective breeding? Pause the video here and take a second on your student version to answer the two questions on the side. If you'll remember back to our genetics units, we talked about traits and how they are passed on to us from our parents and how we can track what is passed on by looking at our genotypes and our phenotypes. The genes in your cells that carry information determine your traits, and that is all coded for in your DNA. This is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is very important to the concept of natural selection. He spent 5 years doing research on the HMS Beagle and wrote the book Origin of Species. In it, he explained how finches, which is what he studied when he did his work at the Galapagos Island, had different beaks depending on where they lived and the food sources that were available to them. Natural selection relies heavily on adaptation. These are body parts, features, or behaviors that help living things to survive and function better in its environment. These are changes that happen over time. They do not typically show up from one generation to the next, but as we talked about with traits, the traits that help an organism to survive get passed down, and the ones that don't tend to die off. So again, pause the video and on your student version, fill out the question for the list of adaptations shown in each of these animals. Reminder of some key vocab: an organism, an individual animal, plant, or single-celled life form, and the environment, the surroundings, conditions in which a person, animal, or plant lives. Take a minute, pause the video. Why do you think favorable traits Why do you think it's the favorable traits that become more common? Answer that question in your student version. Natural selection, the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. Favorable traits become more common over long periods of time as the offspring with favorable adaptations become more common. For instance, this rabbit is blending into his surroundings. If I were to put him next to a brown rabbit, the brown rabbit is more likely to be seen by a predator and thereby not survive to pass on his traits to future generations. Here we go back to Darwin and his finches. Studied them on the Galapagos Islands. He also looked at turtles and several other species on the islands, but is most famous for the finches. He theorized that all the birds he saw on the different islands actually had a common ancestor, but they all had very distinctive beaks. This was because of adaptations that helped them with different types of foods available. Some types of islands had seeds, some had more insects available, some had to get their food by pecking the trees. So different types of beaks helps them to get the food that was readily available on their island. Okay, just taking a look at these different types of beaks right here, we can see and maybe think about what type of beak would be best for getting different types of foods. Okay, cone-shaped, cracking seeds, something very long and sharp might be used to peck into a tree to be able to get insects out of the bark. Pause the video here and answer the think about it question. Talk about how different adaptations would help or hinder an animal if their environment changed. Other examples or reasons for natural selection to occur to help them better hide from predators. For example, deer mice in Nebraska change from dark to light brown because the color of the sand changed. In one ecosystem, lizards adapted to have long legs that could better climb to avoid floods and reach food. Peacocks with bigger and brighter tails were more attractive to female mates and therefore mated more often. Pause the video here and decide which number in each sentence represents the adaptation and fill it in on your student version. Now, the flip side to natural selection is artificial selection or selective breeding. This is a process by which humans choose a trait that we like and we breed that animal or that plant to give us that specific trait. So in this picture, we have a bunch of dogs. We mate dogs based on the characteristics we like. Okay, so here we have generation 1, different types of poodles, different fur colors, but they're all larger dogs. Different generation 2, when I bred a larger dog with a smaller dog, I got some smaller dogs. If I keep breeding the dogs to be smaller and smaller, I can get to teacup poodles. Why do you believe humans selectively breed dogs? Go ahead and pause the video and answer that question on your student version. Selective breeding or artificial selection is also elective breeding. It happens when we intervene, when we mess with things. So for example, these are what foods used to look like before we started messing with them. They don't look nearly as appetizing to eat. So we, through the process of selective breeding, changed them to make them more desirable for us, to give us higher yielding crops. Adaptations that are selectively bred happen over a short period of time. Natural selection typically takes many, many generations for a change to be seen widely through the population. Pause the video and answer the question on your student version. Whenever we talk about selective breeding, and we will talk more about this in a future screencast, we have to just touch on GMOs, genetically modified organisms. We've talked about this a little bit when we talked about CRISPR technology, but GMOs are when we take foreign DNA and we inject it into an organism that could not obtain it from traditional breeding. Okay, we usually do it to introduce a beneficial trait, such as making it more insect resistant, herbicide tolerant, more vitamins, less able to fall prey to viruses. However, just like when we talked about CRISPR and when we talked about designer babies, we don't know sometimes when we mess around with the DNA if we're causing an issue in somewhere else in the genetic code. So go ahead and answer the questions, giving the answers to the essential questions at the beginning. If you still need help, make sure to answer it on the last slide of your student version, and we will go over it in class.